Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Mo Lovett. I work for the Academy of Ideas, and I'll be chairing this event this evening, Does Classical Music Still Matter? And I'm very honoured to be hosting tonight's event on behalf of Wendy Earle, who is the convener of the Arts and Society Forum. As some of you may already know, Wendy is unable to be here this evening because sadly she's just recently lost her mum and the funeral is today. So I'm sure friends and colleagues will join me in sending our condolences to Wendy, who does brilliant work for the Arts and Society Forum, keeping us up to date with some of the most interesting discussions in arts and culture today. And if you do like the work that Wendy does and so many others around the Academy, and you can afford to just offer us a little bit of support, we would very welcome any contribution that you might be able to make to the work that we do that enables us to put on events like this. And my colleague Rob Lyons, who is the co-chair for this evening, will put the link in the chat there. I think he's already done that. That's great. There are so many benefits of being an associate of the Academy. So if you wanted to do that as well, that's the same link, including lots of discounts, special subscription offers and that sort of thing. One of our most recent subscription offers is this series called Letters on Liberty. It's a series of kind of pamphlets exploring all sorts of facets of contemporary life around the theme of liberty. And that also will appear in the chat. And I would particularly draw your attention to this one here, which is called Arts Against Orthodoxy, which is written by a colleague of ours called J.J. Charlesworth, who is an arts critic. And he's written challenging some of the contemporary orthodoxies around cancel culture, around identity politics in the arts, and he really makes the case for freedom of expression, which is something that at the Academy of Ideas we are very much in favour of. So you'll have your opportunity to express your freedom this evening in tonight's discussion. We had a fantastic discussion back in January on classical music, and what was the future of classical music was the conversation that we discussed, and we had a whole range of really interesting kind of contributions from the panel, and we had some interesting contributions from the floor as well, far more interesting than that one, I must say. And we've actually got that on YouTube if you want to check it out. Rob will put the link in the chat, and it's a fascinating discussion. But one of the really interesting contributions that came out of that discussion was from our guest this evening, Professor Marina Frolova-Walker. I hope I've pronounced that right, Marina. And it's in the spirit of wanting to explore ideas in greater depth and to continue discussing and challenging all sorts of ideas that we, Wendy invited Marina to come back this evening for this kind of special In Conversation event on what is the future of classical music in the UK. Marina, as you know, is a professor of music history at the University of Cambridge. She's a director of studies in music at Clare College and a professor of music at Gresham College, also in Cambridge. And I think Rob will put a fuller biography in the chat. It's not the fullest biography of Marina's. You'll have to go and Google her to get that, because she's a very accomplished academic and musician. And we're delighted to have you here this evening, Marina. Thank you for joining us. And Marina and I are going to talk for around 30-40 minutes or so. We're going to have a conversation of some of the themes that came out of last time and build upon some of those. And then we'll open it up in the usual Academy of Ideas way to you, the audience, for any questions, any points, anything that you would like to raise. And it doesn't have to be a question. We're very happy for you to kind of respond to the topic yourself as well. But one of the things that, Marina, when we talked back in January, one of the things we talked about was the fact that classical music is often seen as elitist, and we had a variety of views on that subject, and the implication being that it's often a pursuit by the rich for the rich. And that led to you talking in a way from your position working on the front line, I suppose, as it were, and dealing with admissions at the Faculty of Music at Cambridge, and the sense that there is an element within music education which perpetuates this problem of elitism. So I wondered if we could just kind of launch straight in, and perhaps you could tell us, expand upon that point that you made in January.
Good evening or good afternoon to our international audience. It's lovely that you're all here, and thank you very much to the Academy of Ideas for inviting me, and thank you, Mo, for chairing this and preparing for this with me. It's a great honor. And yes, I'm sorry if I will repeat anything that I said last January, because I can't remember what I said. But yes, we were talking about elitism, and I think I might have said that indeed, when we're trying to admit music students, to study for a degree in music at the University of Cambridge, we very often have very few applications from state schools. Yeah, so most of them come from independent schools. And even if we do have those applications, you find that people from state schools usually don't have quite enough preparation, not enough classes on things that we actually demand of them, to pass this hurdle and to become a student. It is a great problem for us, because you probably know that every university right now, is very concerned with access, with sort of equality of opportunity. And music is really a problematic subject for even our admissions office, because we always basically skew their figures. They're trying to work very hard to admit as many students from state school as possible, and music is always drags these figures down. So there is something about music, that is indeed seems to be sort of an expensive pursuit. It usually has to do something with family money being supportive of instrumental lessons or something like that, but also I think just generally the attitudes of schools to music. I will just kick in with something else as well, if I may, just to make it a bit more acute. So here is a government document, which is just from a few weeks ago. It's a consultation document, obviously, but there is one clause that set our hearts racing, or put our blood pressure up. So number 21, the government proposes that the courses in price group C1 that are not among its strategic priorities, covering some subjects in music, dance, drama, and performing arts, art and design, media studies, and archaeology, are to be subject to a reduction of 50% in funding. So, and then they say in the next point that we believe that these studies are very important, they bring huge benefit to society and culture and so on. So it seems to be a slightly contradictory position. Now, what that means, the 50% reduction, it sounds quite drastic, doesn't it? What actually means in practice, I must say straight away, it's kind of not so bad for us, because basically the government gives us £250 per student at the moment. So they want to cut it to 125, but 125 is still, it's a small proportion of what we get from the fees, which are in excess of £9,000. So in a sense, it's not as scary as it may seem, but the attitude, this formulation, that music is not a strategic priority, and all the strategic priorities were listed above. I think that tells you very much a lot about the attitude of the government, and I think it creates a certain climate which would affect, I think, state schools much more than it would affect independent schools, which can decide for themselves what they do with their music. And I assume will make things even worse. So so that's just to start, an answer to your question, Mel.
And do you think, I mean, there has been, obviously latterly, there's been a lot of focus on STEM subjects, and there's a sense that we need to get young people ready for the workforce, and that, it's those STEM subjects that are really going to kind of kickstart the economy, or they're going to kind of create a more vibrant society. And do you think that has somehow led to a decline in sort of support for arts subjects? Do you see that there being a kind of relationship between those two things, or do you think it's something else?
Oh, I think that there's been so many things that have been gradually leading to this, and I sort of could predict them a few years down the line. For example, I knew that when the fees were introduced, student fees were introduced in the first place, I thought that we will lose some of our intake, that our numbers would go down, which they indeed did. Not so much for Cambridge, because it's still a very elite institution. Let's not make bones about it. It suffers less from these fluctuations. But in other universities, you had this drop in demand. Because it's one thing when you're doing a course, you're paying this money for a course, which would immediately give you a high salary, or job security, or indeed, the work of a musician or even a music teacher, is sometimes much more precarious. And sometimes also our alumni have to kind of coast for a few years using their parents' money before they find their niche, before they manage to actually earn their keep. So it is more difficult for people to make this decision, even to go into music, and possibly some other arts and humanities. So that is definitely the case. But then, of course, we have to look at it in a wider perspective, that currently, we have this economy of growth. It's all about growth. The alternative to that is the economy of well-being. So if we actually ask people, how happy they are. So if you have a society which is economically very prosperous, but it's done at the expense of people's well-being and happiness, and mental health, I'm not sure that we want society to progress like that. So it's a kind of and music is so connected to well-being, so connected to people's quality of life and happiness, satisfaction. And it's very, very difficult to justify our existence. It's amazing that like everyone sort of knows about it. During the pandemic, people were saying, "Oh, we're listening to music. Music is our salvation. It's my friend. It makes me feel less lonely." All kinds of things. And yet, when it comes to government policy, it just doesn't translate into that. So why is this happening? Particularly in this country, in the UK, which is so different, for example, from Germany, which puts culture generally, high culture in particular, very much higher. In the list of priorities.
I mean, I think we can talk about music and well-being and those sorts of things a little bit later on. I certainly think that's one of the topics we might want to get into a little bit. But I wondered, do you see, particularly at Cambridge, do you see a difference in the type of student that is applying to come and study at Cambridge? Is it is it only the rich now, or has it ever been more diverse than it is? Or how do you kind of see that right at the front line?
Well, I think certainly, from talking people in all the generations, who have come from maybe very humble backgrounds and become very established performers, or musicologists, and you realize the opportunities that were there that are not there now. The number of scholarships, because people used to, I don't know, my husband, for example, went to the University of Edinburgh to study music. He was getting a grant. He wasn't paying any fees. He was getting a grant. So now it's you get into debt. So it's a very different situation generally. So starting with that, but of course, talking about what students were taking and what we can teach them in 3 years, that has been changing progressively as well. I've been there at Cambridge for 20 years, and I also been before at the University of Southampton and at Goldsmiths. So I have, quite a long experience in this, and you can see how we have to drop our standards, both of admittance, and of what we require during the degree, progressively more and more, because we start from a lower level. And also things, there are some things which have to do with music, which are very practical oriented. They're not just have to do with reading books. So people actually have to put notes on the page. This is an interesting thing about music. Does history of music or study of music be practical? Yeah, because history of art, for example, is not. Yeah, the way history of art is taught in university, people just look at paintings, discuss them. You don't actually paint. Yeah, so there is an argument, I suppose, to say that music should be the same, and then we will not need the all very, very expensive and very time-consuming preparation of people to actually learn to how to harmonize a melody, yeah, how to harmonize a Bach chorale, which is always something that we still demand at the level of admission. And yet we have to say, if we can't harmonize a Bach chorale, if you haven't been taught, if you've never encountered it, we are not going to take this into account. Yeah, so it's a very contradictory position. We still have this entrance test, but if a student comes and says, well, I've never done this before, you know, I would have to take private lessons to learn how to do that. Yeah, this is certainly not right. Yeah, so and if you don't get people with the level of music literacy like this, then they will flounder during the course. They will not be able to do the course as it's designed now. Yeah, so we would literally have to redesign the whole course and admit people who maybe can't read music. Yeah, and maybe we shouldn't even demand this. You know, they can't read a score. Maybe they can do something else, because it is just very difficult to teach people to do all these things during 3 years. Well, for comparison, for example, I will give you my Russian experience. Yeah, so what we're attempting to do in 3 years, I more or less in Russia had 9 years to do. Yeah, so because I had starting at 15, I had very intense training, 15 to 19, and then conservatory is 5 years. Yeah, so 9 years to learn what we have to squeeze into 3 years. Yeah, so
Yeah,
it's very, very intense.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I noticed, because I worked in music education for a little while before I worked for the Academy of Ideas, and I worked from the point of view of a music organisation that went out into communities and schools and provided music education opportunities. And one of the things I was quite surprised to learn was that certainly at the level of primary school, a primary school teacher doesn't necessarily need to have any training in music education. There's no kind of, within the teacher training qualification, there's no provision that you have to have. But when I was at school, there was always a teacher playing piano as you came into assembly, or, you know, there was always music lessons where, you know, even children that weren't interested in music learned to play the xylophone or learned to sing a canon, you know, in canon or something like that. There was always a kind of basic, and that's no longer required as a kind of basic primary school teaching. So in a way that's been outsourced to national portfolio organizations, you know, arts organizations where musicians come in and the schools pay them a fee and they kind of provide that as a sort of like an extracurricular. So rather than being within the curriculum itself, it's kind of seen as an add-on, and it's seen as, you know, something that you only do if you like music, or you might do, you know, pottery, or you might do music, or you might do sport, or you know, it's very much seen as not sort of embedded in the curriculum itself. But one of the things I was thinking about there when you were talking about the government's response to arts, and I know it's a perpetual problem for the arts, and I think, I can't remember which former prime minister said, you know, fool is the politician that gets involved in the arts, and that's why the Arts Council has always been an arm's length body, because politicians have tended to want to stay out of the arts sector. But I remember working at the Sage Gateshead when the Cameron government, Tory government, came in 2010, and they changed the curriculum at that time to have much more of a focus on instrumentalism, you know, playing an instrument rather than singing and percussion and kind of community art. So there's very much this sense that, you know, they were going to invest in children and being able to be gifted a musician if they wanted to learn. And out of that came the In Harmony project, which we talked about a little bit in Germany, which I always found this fascinating. So for people who don't know, In Harmony is a project where children learn to play in an ensemble. They're gifted an instrument, they have to practice, they're treated, you know, like young professionals. And it was based on a project model that came out of El Sistema in Venezuela. Simon Bolivar set this up for street children, and to give children something to, you know, for their well-being, but for their inspiration, for their happiness. And I've always thought it was very strange, because it's Western classical music that, you know, this project became very successful in Venezuela, and then the UK re-imported it back again. And I've always thought that was so strange that, you know, it didn't come from within the UK itself, but it came from South America. But I know Nicola Benedetti now has cast some concerns about that in Harmony Project, because it was just for the joy of playing a musical instrument. Of, you know, it takes a lot of discipline to learn, and lots of hours of practice and playing together in an ensemble and listening and all the skills that are needed really to kind of be a musician. And yet she's cast some doubt on it. She was a very great supporter of this, and she says it's been instrumentalized a lot more now. So you know, the benefits of In Harmony are seen to be about you know, children being better behaved, so it's not about music. Children performing better in academic subjects. There's a whole thing about music and maths, and the fact that, you know, taking part in music helped your performance in maths. There's the whole Mozart and maths project and all that. So I just wondered, do you worry that the arts and classical music in particular have become instrumentalized a little bit?
You know, we grasp at straws, yeah. So trying to get some funding, yeah, or trying to get some kind of recognition. Obviously people get involved with, for example, music therapy, yeah. So again, you can say this is instrumentalization of music, but it is a very important project, because I think the power of music, yeah, to help people's mental health, to help people generally, is still underestimated, yeah. So I think it is very important to continue to fund that. But you know, that's one example. But indeed, you know, to recognize that music is a kind of an important pursuit for humanity generally, that everyone is somehow involved in music, everyone is musical. This is what the latest research says, that it's just as basic, yeah, for a human being as speech, yeah. So musical behavior is kind of in you already when you are born, yeah. So if you deal with babies, you just know that they kind of sometimes memorize melodies, you know, earlier than they can learn words. So so it is something that is part of it, you know, a part of us, something that is very, very fundamental for human beings. So why don't we kind of recognize this, that it is something that we want to cultivate as well. So, but that's music, you know, just talking about music in general, yeah, and not classical music. So I can see that in the chat there's a question, you know, what about classical music, how we define it. And by the way, a little question that I'm going to just touch upon very briefly about foundation course, because that's to end our discussion of admissions. Because indeed, I think it would have been absolutely ideal if we could have a foundation year, yeah, like the classics, because they, yeah, suffered the same yeah, trouble with children not learning Greek and Latin at school. Yeah, so they basically have to start them absolutely from scratch at university. And you can do that. Yeah, you can do that during foundation years. The same people, you know, coming to learn Chinese, you can start them off really, really quickly. So if we had a foundation year, that would be amazing. That problem would be solved. We could take any talented person from any school, yeah, from any background, and get them up to the level where we think that our education, yeah, should start. But at the moment, yeah, it seems to be impossible. There were talks about it, but you know that nothing is happening in this respect. Even in Cambridge. So yeah, so that's on that side. Now talking about, you know, what is, yeah, the music that we're talking about, it sort of starting to move in slightly different direction, is what should we teach? Yeah, so it's a question of whether say our Cambridge degree should be focused on Western classical music or not. Now, I would be very interested to hear what you have to say. And because traditionally, of course it was, yeah, because that's how the music degree, yeah, was created. It was created around the German tradition, first of all, yeah, of music, and musicology was a German science, Musikwissenschaft, yeah, so it all sort of originally came from Germany, and times change, yeah, so now obviously there is this very strong push to diversify our curriculum, yeah, and basically so many subjects that we teach, yeah, such as harmony and counterpoint, yeah, still are based largely, yeah, so 95% maybe, or even 100% on Western classical music. And people say, well, why should we study this? Yeah, if we are not interested in it, if we are interested, on the contrary, in jazz, or if we're interested in pop or in hip hop, or we're interested in the music of Indonesia, or we're interested in, you know, folk music of Native America, and you know, whatever. And it is a very difficult question, because it's a huge paradigm shift for us. Yeah, so. Should we indeed be teaching people to write fugues? I mean, who writes, what is the point in teaching them to write fugues? There's certainly a point in teaching people to write fugues if they're becoming an organ scholar, yeah, somebody who then leads the choir in church, yeah, at a very high level. They need to understand how this works. But what about all the other people? Maybe they should learn something else. Yeah, so that's a very important change that is coming. And I mean, obviously, from the point of view of a person who is involved, participating in the Western classical music culture, we want to defend, yeah, and protect. We sometimes become very defensive, but we also have to realize there's a pressure from our students, yeah, not from anyone else, from our students, to do other things, because they think that we do not actually reflect yeah, the musical reality of the world, that we become sort of completely blinkered by the idea that Western classical music is the best. And we cannot argue anymore that it's in any way superior to other cultures. Yeah, there's no argument like that you can put forward. So and therefore, yeah, the more things you introduce, yeah, the more sort of different subject you introduce, you still only have 3 years and so many hours, yeah, so something needs to be pushed out. So currently, you know, we're going to cut our Western history, I think, from next year by 30% to accommodate other things.
I mean, I think that's, you know, that's an interesting point about whether we're diversifying in terms of different genres from different places in the world as well. But I mean, you know, I remember when I was taking violin lessons, learning my scales and arpeggios. It's such a chore. I was never very, you know, didn't enjoy it. I wanted to get on and play the tunes, but you know, in order to play the tunes, you have to learn your scales and arpeggios, and you know, you have to practice at the really basic stuff. You know, if you're learning the piano left and right hand, and you have to learn the basic kind of tools of your craft before you can make something beautiful. But because I loved the sound of the violin played properly, I put the practice in, and plus my parents kind of nagged me into it, and I had a very strict violin teacher as well, so I didn't dare not practice. But there was kind of a societal kind of pressure on me, as well as a kind of desire from within for me to get to the point where I actually sounded not too screechy. And that does, I mean, I think that's missing. I think we do live in a kind of much more easy everything age. It's so much easier to kind of do things electronically. And you know, I was speaking to a friend of mine who teaches music at secondary level, and you know, she was saying for young people today, if they want to make music, you know, the desire I had to get good enough to produce a musical sound, not just a screech, it's so much easier for young people today, because there's so much kind of music technology available. If you want to compose a tune, or if you want to replicate your favorite song that you've heard on the radio, you can do it so much more easily today. And I just wonder, do you think music technology is our friend, or is it a challenge, or is it both?
Yeah, I don't want to say that it's our enemy, because I think it can be used very well to actually promote, even things that we care about, including classical music. I think I might have given you this example last time, but what made my son into a classical music listener, I'm not saying that he's a great performer or anything, but he really got the bug. But he got the bug from an app. It was an app on an iPad. It was about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and you could do various things with it. You could compare 4 recordings. You could see the score. You could stop it, pause it. You got an explanation of what was going on. You could play with it. And of course, young people, they want to play with technology. They can't want to do these things. So you can use it, I think, as a tool. Again, to get people into this very, very complex, really, art of not just playing, but also understanding classical music, because I think we don't necessarily all have to play. What I'm mostly sort of trying to argue for is that we have to create an audience for classical music. We have to create a young audience for classical music if we want it to continue, because otherwise, the audiences, if you only start going to concerts when you retire, it's kind of always extremely precarious, to keep this very expensive industry going if you have this sort of almost dwindling kind of audience. Although it's wonderful to have people of all ages, but you also want to bring young people in. And I think this is one of the reasons why I think we can use technology as well. We can play with various things, but it's just that there needs to be a desire to bring classical music into it. I will talk a little bit more. I can see that we've already talked for a long time, but I want to talk a little bit more about the difference that you find in Asian countries, such as in China and Japan and South Korea and so on, in relation to classical music, because it's staggering, what's happening there. If you know what is going on, like there are 45 million pianists in China. Steinway is now a Chinese company because that's where the demand is. It's a hugely prestigious thing to do. Parents want to get their children to not just grade 8, but at least diploma level. Even parents of children who are in this country, they really pressure them to achieve very high level of instrumental performance. So. And there are huge audiences there. So one thing that I wanted to show, which I think it's an animation film, it's a kind of anime made in Japan, which is called Nodame Cantabile. Nodame is a name, and it's about a conservatoire student who's a pianist, and there's a love story, there's all kinds of things. But what is amazing about this animation is that this sense of awe that classical music can elicit is just comes through the screen. This kind of respect for all these the intensity that comes with classical music. I will just hope to be able to show you this.
ショパンピアノ協奏曲第1番補短調作品11。この作品には故郷ワルシャワへの告別と飛翔が込められているという。管弦楽のみで始まる重厚で力強い定時部、そして甘く悲しい第一主題から補長調カンタービレの第二主題。ピアノが登場するまでのこの長く壮大なオーケストラの定時部を聴くと、故郷を絶とうとするショパンがこの曲に込めた気概を感じる。
to show you a little.
テンポにするなんて。
これじゃ全く違う曲だ。
でもすごくいい。
何今の。あんたならどうにかできんでしょ的。
What amazes me about this, yeah, is how they managed to get a little bit of musicology in. They play you like a whole movement of a concerto. Yeah, not a tiny snippet, but a whole movement. They show you what the piece is. Yeah, they give you a sense of awe and beauty, and they're also extremely precise of showing fingers on the keys. It's taken so much time, to work out how the piano, the hands of a pianist move, and they're very, very precise. So there are like, I don't know how many, 50 maybe episodes of this. And the pieces that they use, such as Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto or Chopin First Piano Concerto, they've actually went up the hit list, as a result of that. And so many young people started writing, oh, this is really beautiful music. So but to imagine such an anime to be made in this country, I just cannot, because there needs to be an understanding in society that music is important, classical music is important, of the value of all of this. So that's I just wanted to give you this illustration of what I mean, by classical music in Asia. It's a completely different situation.
I mean, that's fascinating. So how has it, I see we've got some knowledgeable people in the chat here about this clip, but how has that impacted on young people's desire to learn Western music? Is it in South Korea particularly, or in Japan? Has it had a big influence on that, would you say?
Well, and I've just, from what I read, it had a real influence on the listening practices. And I think for classical music, it's very important to just hook people up, with something, with one track. And then they go on Spotify, and Spotify offers them, you listen to this, would you like to listen to that? So they get drawn into it. And we have to kind of recognize that modern technology and the fact that everything is literally accessible at the touch of a button, it can help with this. It's not our enemy. That's just to answer your question. It can be used. It gives you this amazing access to everything, and I think it really we can really say, well, it's not elitist, because you don't have to pay £150 to go to a concert to listen to a piece of classical music. You have to, you can click a button. I was reading, I can't remember, it was, I think, Tchaikovsky's letter or something, and he said, well, I haven't been able to listen to music for such a long time, just because of where he was, because listening meant going to concerts. If there's no concert, you cannot go and hear it. So he felt kind of bereaved, just like we did during the pandemic when we couldn't go to concerts, but at least we can press a button and hear it.
It's funny you should say that, because I don't know if anybody else has watched Howard Goodall's History of Western music, and he talks about this fact that we're so spoiled today, we can just switch a button and we can hear a piece of music of any genre, but of course of classical music at any time. But of course this is quite an unique period in human history, really. If you were in the Middle Ages, you wouldn't hear music every day at the touch of a button, or if you lived in ancient societies, you might have to wait for a festival or something to come along. So in some senses we've got the best of worlds in terms of encouraging people's love of music and young people's love of classical music. Your story about your son, reminded me of my nephew when he was a little boy. He used to go and visit my parents' house, and they always have classical music on. And he used to go, oh, I hate going there. I hate listening to classical music. I hate it. It's for grandmas. This was his attitude. And then when he became a teenager, he got into gaming, all the sort of online gaming, where they play classical music as the soundtrack for the gaming, and he suddenly learned to love classical music by accident, really, and then it didn't make visits to grandma quite so painful for him. But it was that way that he got into music, and I think a lot of young people get into it through movie soundtracks and that sort of thing. I mean, are you of the are you of the opinion that any way in is a good way, or do you think there's there's one set way to get into it? Is it dumbing down to just kind of listen to movie soundtracks and gaming soundtracks, or?
Well, I totally think that any way is a good way. I've become very, very much less of a purist than I used to be. Yeah, I really think that there's quite a lot of pressure, this kind of classical music snobbery. I'm sure some people, in this audience will recognize what I'm saying. Yeah, that, oh, if you listen to Wagner opera, you have to listen to all of it, from start to finish. You have to know all the leitmotifs. You have to have, 49 recordings or something, things like that. There's quite a lot of it. I think we have to recognize and be absolutely honest with ourselves. If a person goes to a Wagner opera for the first time, yeah, you get 5% maybe of the what's in it. Yeah, it's impossible to grasp this. Maybe 20 years later, maybe you'll get to 50%. You will never get to 100%. It's always a partial pursuit. We just kind of tune into something. Opera in particular, it gives you such an assault on your sentence from on your senses, from every direction. It's impossible to process everything. Yeah, so we shouldn't penalize young people for being bored in a concert. We have to tell them, it will be boring. Part of it will be boring. Part of the opera will be boring. Maybe you will like one movement of a symphony and not the other. Because I remember, this is how I started, but I had a sense if I listened to it, several times, it will then somehow, a delayed gratification, it will come. And the process of it, the process of listening and learning with your ears, it is also extremely satisfying. It makes you feel good about yourself that you're now, having something else. So, but at the same time, when classical music is marketed only as music for relaxation, you must have noticed this. This is what's happening constantly in the media, and here's some classical tracks to relax you. Yeah, and musicians get extremely annoyed about this because classical music actually is the opposite. Yeah, there might be some tracks which will relax you, but in fact it demands, most of it, demands very, very intense engagement of your brain, and it can change your mood. Yeah, it can make you time travel or travel to other places. It sort of presents its own space, in which you can live, kind of like an extension of your life. Yeah, but it's not just for relaxation. But again, this is another thing, that we just grasp at every straw that's available. Yeah, and if it's music if it has to be marketed like that, well, classical musicians then have to agree to that and just go along with it.
I want to ask you a little bit about your experience in the Soviet Union, but first, just while we're still on sort of classical music in the UK, I remember once having to introduce Northern Symphonia, and I was asked to do it because the chief executive of the theatre wasn't available or whatever, and I rehearsed what I was going to say, and I went out and I managed to credit everybody and introduce and pronounce everybody's names correctly and everything, but I did one thing wrong, and I can't remember what it was. I think it was that I used a microphone. I think I spoke into a microphone, the kind of sound engineer, and I think it might have been that, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong. And when the chief executive found out that I'd introduced a classical music with a microphone, he went absolutely ballistic, because this is not the acceptable ritual of a classical concert. There is a sense in which I think a lot of people are a little bit frightened about the rituals that surround concert going. My first boyfriend took me to a concert and walked out in the interval and was very happy that he could go for a pint of beer because it was over now. He didn't realize it was kind of the interval. This sort of things. There are lots of rituals and way of behaving at a classical, not clapping between movements and that sort of thing. Do you think that contributes to the fact that it's seen as a very elitist thing? Is there a way to relax that a little bit? There's talk of relaxed concerts, where, you know, children can go, people who have got learning disabilities who can go, who want to, you know, articulate sounds and don't want to sit in silence. And I think all those things are great because they're kind of making it more accessible to more people. But then if you wanted to go to a formal classical music, what of the traditions would you keep? What would you hold on to? And what would you say, no, it's all right, we can afford to relax with some of those traditions and not seem so snobby?
Yeah, yes, it's a really difficult question. Yeah, because, well, one thing, for example, that I also learned from my son, and I was quite shocked, yeah, because he told me, like, I don't want to go to the Royal Opera House anymore. Like, why? Because you make me dress up. Yeah, and you know, as somebody who was like 15 at the time, yeah, he didn't want to dress up. He wanted just to wear his normal clothes, and that shocked me. And I thought, well, this shouldn't be the case. You know, I'm not going to, like, wear whatever you like. You know, I'm not even going to talk to you. Pretend you don't know me. It's much more important for me that he's actually there and he gets this amazing experience. Yeah, so I think, you know, dress code, you know, I love dressing up myself, but I would compromise on that. You know, let's relax. Let's not look askance at young people, you know, who are wearing ripped jeans in the concert hall. I mean, it's actually, you know, various places where I was, I remember going to Bayreuth, you know, and it's terrifying, you know, because the audience of mostly, yeah, this upper middle class Germans, kind of, they just look at you and you feel being judged for everything. So I know how it feels, you know, when you're being judged. I think, you know, applauding between movements, I think it's time to reintroduce that. Because you know, this used to be a practice up to about, I think, the 1920s. Yeah, people were applauding between movements. Composers such as Tchaikovsky wrote their music with that intent, yeah, for it to be applauded to. Why is, for example, the third movement of Tchaikovsky's Pathetique Symphony, yeah, it ends very loud. It's almost impossible not to applaud. And if people didn't applaud at the time, he would complain in the letter, you know, they didn't like it. Yes, so you have to realize that the endings of classical pieces are written with this in mind, to provoke applause. Yeah, because the ending is either very virtuosic, or it could be surprising, yeah, or it could be funny. But it's one of these three things. But it's so that you applaud. So I think, you know, this, apart from obviously pieces which tell you attacca, you know, play straight through, the conductor will show you not to applaud. But I think that could be relaxed. And it makes sense for people to express, you know, their appreciation straight away and not keep it for another 2 hours. So, but one thing that I would not compromise on, and that's something that I care very much about, is the silence. Yeah, and again, I'm not talking about the concerts which are, you know, special concert for children, you know, concert for people with disabilities, where the musicians know this is what's going to happen. Yeah, they know that there's going to be noise, you know, and they're prepared for that. But in an ordinary concert, yeah, I think to keep the silence is very important. And again, I will give you my example from China, where I attended some concerts, recitals in provincial cities. I'm not talking necessarily about, you know, Beijing or Shanghai, but in provincial cities where you will get a full hall, you know, of people coming with babies, with children, and there is not a second of silence. There's just, that culture is not there. People are on their phones, they're filming, children are coming up to the stage and they start a fight. People are constantly moving in and out of the auditorium. And it is basically traumatic for someone who wants to hear the music and concentrate on it, to have this noise around you. So because, you know, classical music, again, it has been written with the intention of its, you know, not all of it, yeah, some of it, like, you know, Mozart divertimentos, but again, at some point, you know, people actually start objecting to the noise. So you need this prolonged and intense concentration, for yourself, yeah, and for your neighbor, yeah, so that we can all enjoy it. So that's one thing which I think would be very important to keep. But, you know, to allow people to bring their drink in, you know, that's, I think, it's a totally good idea, you know, if that's going to help.
Well, listen, I've just noticed that we'll come out to the audience in just a moment, but I noticed Jane has just put in the chat that the Royal Opera House is very relaxed these days, but most people do tend to enjoy dressing up for a sense of occasion. And that reminded me of a theatre production that I worked on that toured to lots of kind of village halls and community centres around the region, and it was £2. It was £2 and £1 concession. It was very cheap, and it was to make it accessible, and it was kind of specially sort of converted for non-traditional theatre spaces. And what really annoyed the community centre managers is that, yes, people would pay their £1 or their £2 and come and watch it, but they really wanted to go to Durham Gala Theatre or Northern Stage or the Theatre Royal, and they wanted to pay £15 or £20 or whatever and have the full kind of theatrical experience. It was a treat, even though, public transport might not be easy getting home to the village late at night and all the rest of it. But there was very much a sense of occasion that, they would forego the £1 down the community centre, but even though it was the same production with the same production qualities, it felt good to be in that kind of traditional theatre space and have that sense of occasion. And I know from previous chats with you, Marina, that we've talked about the UK class system and the way in which the arts sector, talks about accessibility all the time, as if there's a kind of hidden thing that we have to tap into in people. Whereas, I worked with the Soviet director, Lev Dodin, who came to Newcastle, and he marveled at the kind of marketing, the big marketing and PR department we had, and the brochures and the website, and he just thought it was hilarious, because I said, well, how do you sell your plays, your theatre productions? And he said, well, I would put a blackboard out at lunchtime to say the Cherry Orchard is playing tonight, in the evening the theatre would be full. And that would be it. That was his marketing strategy. And that took my breath away. So, I mean, I'm just curious to know what your experience of the Soviet Union is like, and whether the UK class system has kind of got itself all tangled up about high art and low art and popular culture. And
yeah, I do feel very strongly about it, and I do feel that there is a sense that these classes still exist, and people who consider themselves, from the lower classes, would say this is not for us. This is that's the whole idea of saying this is elitist. This is not for us. It's basically, it's a plaything of the rich. And in the Soviet Union, well, because of the revolution, because of the very violent events in 1917, where basically they destroyed their upper classes, sent them abroad, or just, killed them off and expropriated them. But basically the idea in society is that this high art belongs to everyone. And again, there was a danger at one point that they would say this is actually bourgeois art. At the very start, they wanted to kind of get rid of it and create proletarian art. But very soon they realized it's something that is actually can be kept. It can be shared. And I remember, the first Ministry of Culture of the Soviet Union used to say, well, this opera by Glinka, it's like champagne, now you can have it too. And this is very important for me, that now we can have it too. This is it's something that is very valuable, that is a wonderful product of a human mind, and we can all have it, we can all share in it. So this attitude, I think, persisted throughout the Soviet years. I'm not saying that the various horrible things didn't happen, but this attitude to culture, including to high culture, it educated generations and generations of people there. And you will still go to, when the pandemic is over, you will go to any European capital and go into a museum, there'll be Russians there. Precisely because they know, they get into a new city and they go to a museum. so something that, then parents teach their children to do that. It's this kind of, admiration, basically, of high culture and desire to be part of it, which I don't quite see here. And it's also, if you compare it with Germany, where Angela Merkel would go to the opera, she would dress up and go to the opera. I mean, can you imagine? Actually, I have seen, members of the government in the opera, they were all from the labor labor government and or labor opposition, and that was for the Wagner. There's some particular alignment with Wagner and the Labour Party. I don't know why. Yeah, but generally I have not noticed. Yeah, there's sort of people from the government attending opera, attending classical concerts, making it a kind of cultural drive. What I've noticed is that 20 years ago, I was invited to speak on Newsnight on a musical issue about a new book. I can't imagine this happening now. Yeah, I used to present the proms on BBC Two. Now they were moved to BBC Four and gradually, cut down and down and down. So there's definitely a shift, of attitudes to classical music, of how much of it you can show. Even, give you another example, BBC Young Musician of the Year, always was presented in full, at least on BBC Four. The last year, I think they cut it, they made like a 45-minute, this very kind of soundbite version. And you had to go on iPlayer or something to see the full. Why? This is something that is already a niche pursuit. So people who want to hear it, they actually will want to hear the whole piece rather than 5 minutes of it. So this is such a kind of self-defeating attitude that is very difficult for me to
Yeah. Okay, well, look, we'll come out to the audience now. Let's move us over to Greg. Greg Scorza, please.
Hello. I just wanted to start off by saying, so far, fascinating discussion. Secondly, my father is a violinist and composer. My mother is a jazz singer. I also do electronic music. My first album's coming out in the autumn. So I'm a huge fan of classical music and have been since about, 7 or 8 years old. But one thing that me and my family would take umbrage with regarding this discussion is this idea that it's good for people to force themselves to learn how to like something. Because in our household, the attitude has always been, you either like this music, you either like Stravinsky and Bartok and Darius Milhaud and Bohundemuth, which we all do, or you don't. But there's no sense in forcing people to expose themselves to this music or forcing them to try and convince themselves that they like it, because that's not how art should be gravitated toward. It should be gravitated towards voluntarily, and whether or not you like it fairly instinctively. So if someone comes up to me and says, well, I didn't like Stravinsky initially, but after I listened to it for 4 or 5 weeks and I read about it, I like it. That to me sounds like somebody saying, well, I've always thought I was gay, but I worked really hard to enjoy heterosexual sex and now I do. When someone says that to me, I don't think, oh, you've now become bisexual because of education. That you're deluding yourself. So this idea that you like classical music because you learn to like it and you should be forced to learn to like it, from the perspective of a musician and someone who comes from a family of musicians, seems kind of crazy.
Thanks, Greg. That's a nice challenging point to start with. I was thinking about this morning because I can't pass a piano keyboard without wanting to kind of touch it, but my great-grandmother was a pianist, so I don't know whether it's learned or it's environment or if it's just that I love pianos. It's a very good question to start us off there, Greg. Thanks very much. Maureen, next, please.
I was just going to say that there is an unlimited supply of resource for people who want to learn theory or oral on YouTube. And indeed, the old, perhaps when I say old, a year or 2 years ago, the Cardiff Singer of the Year and the Young Musician is available on YouTube as well. I've been watching on iTube in Cape Town this year's. I put it aside because I had a lot of other things to do. And they've got up to the finals, I think. We didn't have the gala concert. Also, just recently, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, a former pupil who I had from age 4 till 12, because of lockdown, he's working at home and he wants to fill his time usefully. So he wants to do a grade 8. So I had to look up the Royal Schools, which is the one he preferred. And they have changed the syllabus in the most amazing way. Between grade 8 and a possible diploma, there is now a purely performance examination. And they have masses. I watched for 2 hours earlier this week of examples of pupils playing their examination. There is no scale, no oral, nothing like that. You present a program of 4 pieces, doesn't have to be chronological, doesn't have to be, preferably not all of the same period, but the pupil is marked on creating a recital. It's actually the gap between the schools and the formal teaching, and their choice whether they want to make a career of music for instrumentalists and pianists. I was interested in the pianists and the singing. And it takes 3 main lines: communication. You are marked on the communication as a whole. No marking is given until the whole half-an-hour program. Communication, interpretation, and the final one is delivery, which covers technique. Also, they take into account your taste in how long to pause. If you're going to present 2 movements of a sonata or something, the music has to breathe, and they are marked on whether they have enough musical sense to take that pause between the movements. And it seems that there's a tremendous demand for teaching at the moment by younger people, filling in their time because they now are at home.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Maureen. So a couple of questions then, well, quick couple of points really, Marina, if you want to respond to them. And also, I'm just kind of looking at Jane's comment in the chat. I will try and go back over the chat. I'm sorry if I'm missing people here, but you know, Jane's saying these days, I'm not just picking on Jane, she just happened to catch my eye line here. These days, the Royal Opera is somewhat tying itself in knots over this elitist tag. And I, you know, this is something that I worry about massively, being a working class kid who loves high art, what they term high art. I love classical music and, you know, the best in arts and culture. And it's something that I think the Arts Council always used to say, that, you know, they wanted to promote the best that a society could produce. Whereas, and the Great Art for Everyone tag was something that was really, you know, meant to encourage people from all backgrounds to experience the best of society can produce, but it's now been replaced by this idea of cultural democracy, which I, rather than the democratization of the culture, which is making, you know, the finest art and culture accessible to us all, is this idea of cultural democracy where everybody just gets to create anything they want and all art is treated equally. And I do worry about that, and I'm never sure whether I'm being an elitist or if I'm just saying there's something about art that is elite. You know, there is something about culture which is the best that human beings can produce. So I always get myself tangled in knots as well. I don't think I am an elitist, but anyway, Marina, did you want to pick up on anything that Maureen and Greg said there? And please do raise your hands in the audience if you've got anything.
Yes, thank you very much, Greg. You know, a great comment. Thank you for that. I mean, I would agree that, you know, you can't force somebody to love something, you know, so maybe we have to kind of go careful, you know, with young children about it. But I do not buy your comparison. Because, you know, if we talk about sexuality and we sort of think that, oh, this is part of your identity, this is something that you cannot change. It's different, I think, with education. We might encounter something and not like it at first, and then we will encounter the same thing in a different context, and it will grip us, or at a different level of our life. I mean, I can give you an example. You know, when I was little, I didn't had no interest in learning German, for example, because, well, Russia has problems with German, starting from the war and everything. You know, German was something that I wasn't particularly interested in, didn't want to learn it. When I encountered it in Schubert's songs or in Schumann's songs in the Lieder, and I wanted to understand these songs, and suddenly this language has become the most beautiful. So you can change your perception, and I think So, you know, I'm not buying your comparison. I think with education, things are much more flexible, and you can change your mind. And of course, I'm speaking as a propagandist. Yeah, I'm speaking as somebody who wants to, as an advocate. Yeah, so obviously I'm going to force people and impose it on them, you know, as much as or find ways to infuse them. I mean, this is my role. Yeah, so if my role was something else, I would advocate for something else. Yeah, so I'm biased. I'm totally biased. Yeah, so and I think once we just have to give people an opportunity to actually try it out. And why do I think it's so important? Not because it's the best. Yeah, no, I'm not going to argue that it's somehow, you know, supreme culture that is more superior, yeah, than folk song or any other arts. No, I'm not going to argue that. I'm just love it. Yeah, I love it. I know what it can give you, how it can enrich your life. I want to share it. Yeah, I want other people to experience what I have experienced. Yeah, so that's the only reason. Yeah, so there is, you know, obviously we always compete with types of music that might be more commercially viable because more people like them, and this is why it feels like a little bit of an endangered species. So, you know, so that's my perspective. And responding to Maureen, I agree that there are plenty of resources now, and so many people have now produced new resources during the lockdown. And I think it may be possible to use them. It's sometimes very hard to actually achieve proficiency in harmony and theory without a teacher, yeah, just by watching videos. It's something that requires, I don't know, a lot of hours and a lot of perseverance. Even, you know, if it's jazz harmony, it's extremely difficult, yeah, to grasp it. So, and but schools then have to direct, I think, their pupils to those resources, yeah, because why don't they do that? Why do we still get people who want to actually do a music degree and come to us and say, oh, yeah, no, I haven't thought about this, you know, I'm playing this piece, but I've never asked myself a question who this composer is, you know, what century they lived in. So you know, so the schools also have to open minds to the context in which musical works exist, yeah, and to how they are made, I think in much more proactive way. That's my hope anyway.
And just a nice thanks, Miriam. It's just an interesting comment in the chat there from Jay Bryan, who I think we're talking about Young Musicians of the Year here, or it could have been last night at the proms, whichever clashed with Line of Duty. And he or she makes the point that, you know, there was gushing presenters about the music, but they weren't really told much about the kind of music behind the performances. And you know, it sort of reminds me of, you know, Prince Philip's funeral, right? Talk about classical music being popular on social media. People were alive with not, you know, various elements of the funeral, but there was very much a kind of populist love of the music at the funeral, from that glorious kind of pared down quartet to the lone piper to all of the music, really. I think some of the pieces have been commissioned by Prince Philip himself, but when you look at it in the musical press, you know, there was hardly anything written about, you know, about the pieces of music itself. So there is a kind of event that a lot of people tuned into, whether you're a monarchist or not. You know that music was incredibly beautiful, and people, it wasn't talked about so much in the press. And it reminds me of you know, having to work in contemporary dance and being absolutely scared because I didn't know the language. I don't know how to talk about contemporary. I like it, it's nice on the stage and it's very beautiful, but I haven't got the language to talk about it. And I just wondered if that's something that you've noticed, Marina, that we don't talk about the music itself in, you know, kind of in popular culture as much.
This is something like that John Rutter wrote an article about, yeah, in after Prince Philip's funeral, because everyone kind of agreed that the music was very much a part of it. Yeah, it was part of this very, very moving experience, and that the music was at such a high level. You know, my heart went out to those singers who had, instead of singing in a choir as they would normally do, yeah, during the pandemic, there was just 4 or 5 of them, yeah, doing it. so exposed. Yeah, it's just one voice, you know, millions of people watching live. Yeah, just to understand what goes into it, how many years of extremely high level training goes into it, and then you read reports of it, and barely anywhere, yeah, they were mentioned, and also the music, you know, to find actually the repertoire of the pieces that were performed was quite hard. You know, I didn't recognize one of the pieces, one of the funeral marches, so I went and found out it was listed actually as a Beethoven funeral march number 3, and then I found out it wasn't actually written by Beethoven, it was by somebody else. Yeah, so there's an interesting story to be told there. Yeah, but in some kind of commentary, you would expect, you know, a commentary on something that went on. And was such a big part of it, yeah, the soundtrack, and there wasn't, yeah, which means we kind of take it for granted. It's there, yeah, it's part of our experience, but we're not focusing on it. So I would absolutely agree, you know, that it is something, you know, that somebody could make even a program about, you know, of what music was sung and for what reason. And what you say about the gushing presenters, that is also, you know, for some reason they want always to say, oh, you know, this is so wonderful, instead of actually giving you the whole piece to listen to. So, yeah, there might be some things, you know, that I would change, but.
Marina, I just want to say that your Russian composers at Gresham College have been the highlight of my year, because in South Africa, we don't get the opportunity. Lockdown forced me to look. I've never heard of Gresham College, and Peter Donohue's playing and your commentary has been an absolute, you know, like going to university again for me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's really gratifying to know that. Thank you.
Oh, that's brilliant. We have to try and put that in the chat so other people can listen into that as well. That's great. Listen, I'm going to come out. We've got a couple more people. My colleague Jeff Kidder, who's co-host and can't raise his hand, is next, and then Rush after that. So Jeff.
I've just got a question. You're presenting, Mo and Marina, you're presenting, it's like a UK problem, that the Britain doesn't really get classical music. And I know some of my family are from Vienna. They have a very different attitude to classical music and to what's known as high culture generally, and people in the UK. So is it a UK problem? And then how come places like, somebody mentioned Elster Steamer earlier, you know, places in, like, whether it's Venezuela or East Asia, as you've seen, have a much higher level of appreciation across society for classical music? I mean, me being simplistic, is that because those societies treasure what it used to be known as Western values and Western culture to a higher level than we do here now? Or is that much too simplistic? I've always seen it a bit like that, but maybe it's much more complicated, that in the UK, we're so keen to be relevant and whatever, we don't see the value of these very important things, whereas in other parts of the world, those things are still valued and treasured in society. So I'm just not quite sure. And is it just the UK? There must be other places as well where classical music isn't validated as highly, you know, in the same way that it isn't here.
Interesting. Thanks, Jeff. A couple of people say in the chat it's perhaps a bigger problem in the US, but I wonder if it's Anglophone countries. Anyway, Rush, to you next, please.
Professor, I've also greatly enjoyed your Gresham College lectures on Russian composers. I think one of the reasons for that, along with a lot of the other lectures that the Gresham College offers on music, part of the reason is because I feel that I wasn't necessarily taught how to listen. I think one of the things that classical music demands is an extra layer of, I guess, cognitive interaction with the music, which doesn't naturally come and is a lot more difficult. And I think having that has been really useful and helped me appreciate music a lot more. I've also wanted to ask you about some of the changes at university. So I've been aware of some of the changes that have been occurring at Cambridge, to a lesser extent Oxford and other, I guess, fairly elite universities here. I wondered how much you thought this was a widespread demand for change from students, or whether it was a small vocal minority that wanted to, I guess, sideline a Western-centric or a canon-focused musical curriculum and a music history curriculum, and to what extent it was a wholesale demand for change. And I wonder what you thought of the argument that Cambridge, for example, isn't anywhere. It's actually in Northern Europe. It's in East Anglia, and it should surely have a curriculum that's centered around Western classical music, that puts counterpoint, chorales, and the history of Western music at its center. Isn't that a valid way of thinking about the way that music is taught in a Western university, or is that something that do you think is kind of fairly outdated? And why, for instance, do you think there isn't like an anti-Western classical movement in places like East Asia, especially in places like China, which even as it tries to project itself as a global power and export its own culture, actually places a lot of primacy on Western classical music?
Brilliant question. Thanks, Rush. Yeah, I think this decolonization argument is something that we definitely have talked about before and ought to give more consideration to. That's wonderful. Anne or Harley, I think.
Harley, hi. So I just wanted to share a sort of sadly dispiriting story of music education that we've experienced for our son, who's now 16. Got off to a great start. When he was a toddler, there was this thing, the Royal National Hall, South Bank anyway, put on called Fun Harmonics. Fun Harmonics, which was just a kiddie-friendly classical concerts, but with some amazing music. And it'd be funny hearing some of the parents going, "Oh, they can't, kids, Stravinsky, it's not for kids." But actually, Stravinsky wasn't for them. The kids were lapping it up. And just, about at that age, they'll just take it all in. But sadly, that sort of attitude of, it's not for the kids, we then encountered when he got to primary school, endless battles with the music teacher about things, saying, well, there's loads of free concerts. London's brilliant for that. Take the kids up to see some of this classical stuff. Oh no, we couldn't do that. That would just confuse and unnerve them. So there was none of that in primary school. And then when he got to secondary school, there was a music GCSE when he joined secondary school, but it was gone by the time he's about to leave. And there was a sort of journey from it being an actual proper music GCSE to something that was more sort of therapeutic, relevant, and so on, and dumbed down, really, to the point that no one was interested in taking it. It then muted into something called performance arts, which was a general thing about, getting kids into, on TV or into drama or dance or whatever. And then no one wanted to do that either, so it's now gone. So, I'm sure that's not an uncommon sort of range of experiences, but why such a low expectations amongst the education profession of what children are capable of? Our son, we've had to send him to to get his music education, we've had to send him to a weekend school, which I'm going to big up because it's brilliant. Colour strings, they've got the highest expectations of the kids, and it's amazing, absolutely amazing what they get out of them. But why is that the exception?
Brilliant question. Thanks, Harley. Okay, Marina, quite a few questions to come back on there. Just take any of those that you want to.
Yeah, well, as somebody said in the chat as well, that it's a US problem as well. In fact, kind of worse. I mean, I think during the pandemic, we really saw that the US has treated its classical musicians even worse. Yeah, like the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra just, were not paid, and, was sort of left completely without support and so on. Yeah, I mean, to say why this happened, yeah, hugely difficult question. And of course, it's very individual. And for every country, as I've explained to you, the Russian story, I'm not saying that that they are kind of the best at it, but there was certainly this culture, yeah, of respect for high art, and also, of course, the culture of musical performance at a very high level, yeah, which was part of the Cold War strategy to win, yeah, soft power and everything. Yeah, Russians had to win every single instrumental competition, and in fact, you know, it was very skewed in that direction. While what is happening in the UK, and it took me some time to begin to appreciate it, is this wonderful culture of amateur performance, you know, and like really diversified. In Russia, everything is very centralized, in Moscow and Petersburg, you know, and maybe a couple of other places. Here, yeah, like almost every village potentially, yeah, has its own little festival, and people actually support it, yeah, on the ground, because there's so many churches as well, because in Russia they've blown them up, and here, you know, they haven't. So the beautiful acoustical spaces, yeah, and people can actually, you know, pay their money to support this, which I think is wonderful, and also wonderful culture of, you know, that is now going, unfortunately, yeah, but that in schools people would learn not even one instrument, but 2 instruments, 3 instruments, something that doesn't happen in Russia. Yeah, so the UK has its own very good traditions, which I don't want to denigrate. I think I want us to build on that, yeah, and to see how this from the ground up we can get to somewhere to the levels of the government and general media, you know, discourse about the music, classical music. So yeah, so too difficult for me to answer, you know, why there is a reason. That there is a very traditional sort of idea of England being land ohne Musik, yeah, so where the upper classes were not interested in music, but rather in sort of horse riding and, you know, sports and things like that. So that's something that is very, very deeply ingrained, and some of the quotes from 100 years ago kind of still apply. But you know, obviously Germany, because of all the German composers that they had, is in a very different position. So it's very hard for me to generalize about it. I'm just, you know, more concerned with what we can do. But of course, the pressure from the US, they kind of, these huge corporations, yeah, that basically produce mass culture, you know, they probably have their own interests and so on. Now the question about decolonization, yeah, which I only touched upon, and I would say this is a painful issue. You know, this is an issue that we've been debating. You know, there's a huge pressure. Where does the pressure come from? Your question is, it is coming from a vocal minority. It starts with a vocal minority for sure, but then it spreads, and very soon it becomes a majority opinion. Yeah, because it's a kind of very sexy idea, yeah, to, you know, but because indeed, like, why Western classical music? Why? Yeah, well, give me one reason why. I already told you, we can't say that it's the best music, and there are all kinds of musics in the world. Why do we study this? And it's very, very difficult to answer this question. I mean, I've been struggling with it myself, my colleagues as well, and I think that part of this debate is actually very interesting and very necessary. For example, this idea that we have to rediscover various Black composers, yeah, who wrote classical pieces, or women composers. That is absolutely a fair demand, you know, and a lot of interesting music has come to light because we're interested in it, yeah, not just because it's the music, another symphony by Beethoven, yeah, but because it's something that interests now. It interests us now. Yeah, why, for example, women were sidelined. Yeah, it interests me. I want to take up as a next research project looking into, for example, women pianists, piano virtuosos of the 19th century. Well, there were a huge number of them. You know, a lot of them from the Jewish background. Russian conservatoires, the piano faculties had more women than men. Yeah, and quite a lot of them played concerts, and when you read the reviews, you never see these things. Oh, you know, her playing was really feminine. Yeah, something that you expect. They didn't say that. They kind of completely ignored the issue of gender. So it's an interesting thing. So there's certainly, you know, lots of debate, you know, about this representation. One thing that I do not agree with, and I would argue with, is, I think, which is very damaging, you know, to say that there is something at the core of Western classical music that is racist. Yeah, and that has been said. That the music itself is racist, that the music itself is kind of damaging. You know, we had all kinds of radical, you know, students telling us that they've been harmed by our studies, right? So it's very difficult to counter this, but I think we need to. And of course, you know, we now have sort of examples of musicians from all kinds of backgrounds, you know, Black musicians, Asian musicians, yeah, who are involved in classical music and are passionate about it. And so many people who came from the lower classes that says, no, it's not elitist. No, it's possible, you know, to make a career in it and so on. So this is what we need to capitalize on. But generally, you know, in Asia, yeah, the situation is different precisely because historically they wanted it was a matter of prestige for them to get into Western things. You know, I have a couple of students working on very interesting dissertation topics about that, one on China and one on Korea. Yeah, so, but it's something again that is promoted from the state, that comes from the top, and they're told, you know, this is a good thing to do. You know, you'll get a better job if you're good at piano playing. Yeah, so kind of very interesting things. And it's not to say, that's not to say, yeah, that necessarily everything that is happening in China with respect to classical music is correct, but we have to admit, I think we're accepted now, yeah, that possibly 80% of our conservatoire students are now coming from Asia. Yeah, and people who are, and at first, yeah, there was a lot of racism about it, and said, oh, they can't play, they're all kind of mechanical. But now we know that this is not true, because there are some wonderful musicians such as Eric Liu, for example. Nobody will ever say this about him, yeah, that he plays like a machine. Nobody, because it's such an incredibly, yeah, wonderful. And so eventually, yeah, after years, we accept this new situation, that this is the dominant force. Yeah, and this is where the power of classical music, at least performance, lies now. Yeah, so we're kind of lagging behind. It's very difficult to compete with people who still have this very strict discipline and sense that they, you know, that they have to achieve a certain level and so on. Very difficult for somebody who comes from this indeed kind of easygoing, you can achieve whatever you dream of, yeah, society, because indeed you are not going to achieve what you dream of just by dreaming of it. Yeah, you have to put a lot of hard work into it. So sorry, it's a slightly kind of all over the place answer to your question. And yeah, and the answer to Anne and Oliver, yes, it's not an answer, obviously. That is saddens me a lot, and that I think there are so many opportunities that are wasted. And I absolutely agree with you that if children are not told that this is boring, yeah, they're not necessarily going to be bored. I mean, that this was tried and tested when, again, after the proletarian revolution, they let, yeah, proletarians and peasants into the Bolshoi theater. Yeah, and they found out actually, or to hear a modernist play or something that they would not understand. And actually they did understand, they did get involved in it. Unless you tell them, this is not for you, this is elitist, this is boring, yeah, this is too complicated. And then people, of course, have this reaction, defensive reaction, and say, oh, it's not for me, it's elitist. Yeah, if you as a society accept that, you know, there is a point in trying. Yeah, it's not a problem if you don't like it, but if you tell people in advance that this is boring, or really kind of make something completely watered down out of it, I think that is very sad. Yeah, because people are challenged, and people are challenged to such a high level in maths, for example. Yeah, what they're challenged to do in school in maths, I couldn't do right now. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying. Yeah, so why can't they learn counterpoint, for example? it's considered sort of impossible. Oh no, write whatever you like, you know, it's complete freedom, you know, let's not learn the rules of counterpoint. Somehow music, yeah, is supposed to be all completely, yeah, easygoing, but people enjoy the challenge of learning about quadratic equations. Yeah, they enjoy the challenge about the periodic table. So why wouldn't they enjoy the challenge of learning notation, learning harmony? Yeah, there's something that we need to change in that respect, I think.
Yeah. That's brilliant, Marina. I'm going to give the audience sort of one more chance to raise any questions or any points, and then we'll just come back to you for a sort of final summing up, if that's all right. But it just sort of reminded me a little bit, Greg, reminded me a little bit of Dennis Whelan, who I think might be here tonight. And in our last meeting, he was talking about the British upper class, the elites, and just that point that you said they've never been that interested in the arts. You know, they've always been the horse riding and the countryside, and that's kind of, you know, the stalker hats, and that's kind of our image of the sort of British upper class. But and it's interesting now that one of the main reasons that working class people say they don't go to the theatre and they don't go to classical music concerts is it's not for the likes of me. That is kind of a repeated refrain, which I don't remember at all growing up. Even though I grew up in a, you know, working class household, I don't ever remember thinking that classical music and theatre wasn't for me. Part of my research at the moment, I've been looking at the foundation of the Arts Council, and it's very much the Bloomsbury set and John Maynard Keynes who set up the Arts Council, and he made the Council for the Encouragement of Music and Arts, as it was, and this was sort of in the war period when Britain was being bombed, and we had a lot on our mind. Talk about pandemics, you know, the Second World War, there was an awful lot going on, but yet still within all that sort of confusion and that time of upheaval, John Maynard Keynes and others made the case for having an arts council that would support and develop arts and culture in this country, that would be state subsidized, and that would be, you know, accessible to all. And there was also kind of the rise of the BBC and kind of Play for Today and all sorts of music recitals on the BBC, that there was a real sort of public appetite from all sections of society for arts that seems to be somehow missing today. But it was sort of instrumentalized even then because it was seen to be sort of civilizing, you know, the working class should get involved in the arts because it would be civilizing, or it was about glorifying the nation. So in some senses, it was always sort of slightly, there had to be a reason for the masses kind of being involved in culture. But it certainly seems to have shifted a little bit, certainly in my lifetime. I just never ever thought of myself as not being able to pick up a violin or go to the theatre or whatever, whereas my very, very sort of upper middle class friend, when I told her about this evening, she works in music as well, in music education, and I told her about this evening's event, and she said, "Why are you talking about classical music? It's racist." So she's very upper middle class. She's got the whole kind of critical race theory thing going on. She thinks that classical music is elitist, and that it's, you know, and that it needs to be diversified, and that it excludes certain groups in society. Whereas me, kind of lowly beginnings and all the rest of it, I think it's wonderful. So there's some kind of inverse snobbery thing going on there, or some kind of, you know, metropolitan elite and old elites kind of clashing or whatever, and somehow sort of arts and culture seems to get caught up in the middle. But look, I will just go out to Greg. I think if anybody else wants to put their hands up, that's great, and then we'll come back to you for a sort of final summing up, if that's all right, Marina. Greg.
Okay, I have a question this time around. I wanted to ask what your thoughts were on the 20th and 21st century classical music, pre-20th century classical music distinction. And the reason I ask this question is because I've noticed that when people want to defend Western values and want to popularize classical music for the masses, they're normally talking about pre-20th century classical music. They're talking about Brahms and Beethoven and Bach and things like that. And typically people who like 20th and 21st century classical music, people who are composers, like my father, for instance, tend to hate or find boring music that came before 1900, whereas people who like the traditional music that came before 1900 tend to really dislike 20th and 21st century classical music because they find it really dissonant and abstract and unappealing and inaccessible. So I wanted to ask you, if you want to promote classical music for the masses in the name of promoting Western values, are you going to include 20th and 21st century music by composers like Stravinsky, Bartók, Darius Milhaud, Paul Hindemith, and more recently, Yanis Kyriakidis and Mason Bates and Frank Zappa and Conlon Noncaro and Steve Reich.
Brilliant. Thanks, Greg. That's a good question for us to end on. Marina, if you want to kind of respond to that, by all means.
Well, great point. Absolutely. Well, I don't think you know what happened. Yeah, in the middle probably of the 20th century, that at some point composers lost touch with the audiences. You know, why it happened, you know, there might be all kinds of, you know, the very convoluted explanations of why that happened, and people got fascinated with the idea of dissonance and so on. Yeah, they started talking about musical progress. Yeah, that music that we're writing from now on has to be this very abrasive, very dissonant music, and so on. Something, you know, that people expect it to happen. Yeah, people are showing that actually expect it to happen, that eventually people will get onto this music. Never really happened. Yeah, and not en masse anyway. Yeah, so I think now we're playing even less, you know, Schoenberg and the post-war avant-garde such as Boulez than we played, you know, 10 or 20 years ago, and so on. Yeah, so it's kind of falling out of the canon on its own. It's very difficult to bring it back. And now when whoever, you know, plays Schoenberg in a recital, they will be immediately confronted, like, why are you doing this to us? Yeah, so let's just agree that there is very different kinds of 20th and 21st century music. I think Stravinsky is doing okay. Yeah, he has a few pieces of which are very much loved. You know, whereas people like Russian composer Prokofiev, Shostakovich, you know, are doing okay. Steve Reich, I think, is doing fine. You know, minimalism is everywhere. Yeah, it's completely infiltrated every single slot on TV, you know, music scores, everything else. You know, composers like Einaudi, which is probably, it was now also considered a classical composer. Some people would not accept that, but because it's piano, it's sort of marketed as classical music. Also, don't need to to be helped. Yeah, that they're doing fine. Unfortunately, in general, I would say that what is produced now, today, 21st century music, has very little chance of entering that canon. You know, it seems that the canon has sort of closed down, why that happened? The last composer who had like a real national, in Russia at least, the national significance was Shostakovich. After that, there's nobody else. The same thing in the West. Very, very difficult to find somebody who would write kind of very difficult, challenging music and yet be popular. So in a sense, you know, I'm worried about saying this, but it feels like it's a closed chapter. And in a sense, if we want to study it, if we want to enjoy it, it would be a bit like enjoying, say, Greek tragedy or something like that. It's something that is not written anymore. We're not writing any ancient, classical tragedies. So, and it is a sad thing. But at the same time, I feel that the whole concept of classical music, which includes all these things necessarily, is also a kind of artificial thing, and it will change all the time. And who knows what the new composers are going to produce. The problem is now that, that new music is being played once, if it's played at all. It's called the curse of the second performance. The premiere is also the dernier. Somebody sort of, so that is the issue. So and usually, I don't know whether you know that, but in the past, new pieces of music were actually played twice sometimes in the same concert. So they were getting the second performance immediately, because actually it's important, to hear something twice, more than once. And then, maybe on the second listening, you already want to hear it the third time. If you play it once, I don't think, these composers have a chance. So I'm all for, having this music performed, but it has to be performed more than once. If you just get a BBC prom commission and it's performed once and never heard again, Yeah, it's kind of, it's not part of the thing that we're actually talking about. So, but, you know, who knows which way it will go. These days, you know, it's the Spotify culture, as I call it. Yeah, so everything is divided now into songs, which in itself is kind of, but it means that people listen to music in a very different way. Yeah, they can listen to a one movement of Mozart piano sonata and go on to Frank Zappa. Yeah, so, and or go on to, I don't know, my son discovered Mendelssohn's octet somehow, you know, and got completely obsessed with that piece just through Spotify. Yeah, so you're accidentally you're making connections which are different, which are not sort of in the context of history. And I think we will have to accept that our world is changing, and we have to be flexible, we have to be less snobbish, but also have to be more proactive about promoting the things that we believe in and that we love in. No, that's a good point to end on.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks very much, Marina. That was thoroughly engaging. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I'm sure it's a conversation that we'll keep on having well into the future. If anybody, obviously we're coming out of lockdown now, I'll leave the chat on for a little bit, and you know, we can chat informally for the next sort of 10 minutes if people want to mute themselves and all the rest of it. And I think Rob's going to pop in the chat. There he goes. If you want to make a little donation to help us to keep these things going, and you know, if there's any discussions that you want us to explore, you know, do feel free to get in touch with Wendy or myself or Jeff, and suggest, because I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge. All of the things that we've talked about tonight, we're not going to solve these problems overnight. So, but anyway, perhaps everybody could just unmute themselves or use their clap function or whatever, and just give Marina